Maureen Benjamins completed her sociology BA degree at Duke in 1998, where she was also captain of the Duke volleyball team. She played volleyball professionally in Europe briefly before she went on to graduate study at the University of Texas in Austin. She completed her PhD in 2004, the same year that this article was published from part of her dissertation research. The following year, she started a postdoctoral research position at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and today is a senior research fellow at the Sinai Urban Health Institute affiliated with DePaul University, where she collaborates on large-scale studies of urban health with special attention to religious factors and old age in the Chicago area. This dissertation-based research takes us from consideration of the place of religion in childhood or early adult life to a different focus on the other end of the lifespan. How does our involvement with religion as a social institution change in old age? Benjamins offers us some insights and answers to this question. While delayed marriages and a falling birth rate may be part of the story behind declining religiosity at younger ages, when we shift our gaze to the other end of the life cycle, we find a very different story in contemporary American society. There, as Maureen Benjamins points out, religion is getting more important all the time. That same falling birth rate guarantees smaller future generations at the younger life stages, which magnifies the share of people at the oldest ages. 100 years ago, the percent over age 65 out of the total population was in the low single digits, but within the lifetimes of most people born today, 1 out of every 4 or 5 people in the country will be above that age boundary. We already know that religiosity tends to increase as people get older, so if those older people become a bigger share of the population, religion is going to move towards the front of the stage in society. Benjamins is interested in more than just sheer numbers of older people, though. She's also concerned that as we reach the oldest ages, more and more problems and limitations come along to plague our everyday lives, perhaps even disabling us, making us dependent on others for help, or even claiming our lives. All of the health problems multiplying in this elderly population pose a tremendous challenge, possibly even a threat to the U.S. economy and to our society. So Benjamins is hoping that, as some earlier research has suggested, religious activities and attitudes might actually improve health and prevent some of these problems. Could religion contribute to reducing the health problems in old age? The trouble with designing research to find out is that, particularly for religious activity like church attendance, we're right back to the old chicken and egg problem yet again. Suppose we find out that there are a lot of really healthy old people going to church every Sunday. That could mean 2 very different things. First, it might mean that going to church makes you healthier. That would be great. But second, it might mean instead that only healthy people are able to get out and make it to church, what we would call a selection effect of healthy people into church attendance. Instead of church causing good health lets you go to church. We have to find some way around this obvious problem of causal interpretation before we can start digging around in surveys and other data to test such ideas. So why does Benjamin think that going to church might actually be the causal factor here with a potential to improve people's health? She looks at previous studies and suggests that in fact there might be 3 separate reasons why religion could be good for you. The first of these reasons she calls health behaviors. If we think of a causal arrow running from church to better health, these health behaviors form an intermediate stop along the way. That is, going to church improves your health behaviors, and then your better health behaviors steer you down a better path in old age with fewer disabilities cropping up in your future. Other people have studied this many times before. There are even some classic old studies that show that Catholic nuns have amazingly low rates of things like lung cancer, heart disease, liver problems, and so on, because their lives are directed away from harmful patterns of consumption and other bad health behaviors. What works for the nuns might work for all of us to some degree. The second possible link between greater religious commitment and better health could operate through improved mental health. There's also a huge body of research showing that more religious people don't get as depressed as often as other people. They deal better with stress and have safe paths to follow in dealing with anger, grief, and other emotional trauma. These kinds of stress are turning out to have a lot of consequences for physical health. So if you enjoy better mental health by being religious, you may avoid or postpone more of such negative physical consequences too. Finally, the third intervening factor between religion and healthier aging might be what Benjamin calls social support. She actually includes two different and mutually reinforcing things under this label. First, churches themselves can offer a sense of community, friendships, activities, and social interactions that make people more connected to others and less lonely, which can be a serious problem in old age in particular. Second, as we know from looking at earlier stages of the life course, families and religion remain pretty closely connected, even in modern, highly differentiated American society. So more religious people are likely to have more family connections too. And people with more family connections, people who are married rather than single, parents with children, and so on, are likely to be more involved in religion. Since a better web of social connections to others is a big help in staying healthy as we get older, religion could be improving our late life health by encouraging and stimulating these connections. Benjamins thus has some solid reasons for guessing that religious activities and beliefs might be helpful in maintaining health and preventing disabilities in that rapidly growing fraction of our population occupying older ages. But she has one more idea that she wants to look into, also based on her reading of previous research on this subject. Just because you cross the invisible age boundary of 65 and suddenly get counted in this older population does not mean that the rest of your life will be one steady, unchanging landscape of activities, relationships, and of course, health conditions. After crossing that boundary, we continue to grow, change, and age steadily. In fact, gerontologists who study old age often distinguish between young and old age, with people under 85 usually still pretty healthy, even though they may be retired and leading a very different life from previous decades. After about age 85, these health problems start to rush in from all sides and become much more common, more serious, and more prominent in our lives. Since that is the case, Benjamin also would like to find out whether, within the larger range of all elderly ages, usually meaning all ages where most people are retired from the labor force, the importance of religion and its potential health benefits work differently for the oldest old than for the younger old people. The things that matter before age 85 may matter even more after that age, or they could also drop out of the picture and no longer have as much potential benefit. She decides to look into this question too. Although all the possible links between religiosity and better health in old age sound plausible when we hear Benjamin's hypotheses, one never knows whether an argument that sounds good when you tell someone will also stand up to the glare of actual empirical evidence. So Maureen Benjamins knows that she has to come up with some good evidence and then test her ideas against it. First, she has to be very clear about what she means by health in old age. You can measure such health in countless ways. Benjamins elects to measure what she calls disabilities, because these appear to be pretty reliably measured for large populations using sample survey interviews, and because they're directly connected to our social interactions with other people in society. The most commonly studied disability measures appear in a list called the Activities of Daily Living, or ADLs. Can you get out of bed in the morning, go to the bathroom, take a shower or a bath, get dressed, go out to the kitchen and take care of your own breakfast? If you can do all of these things without any help, you have no limitations in your basic activities of daily living. The more things you need help to do, the more limitations you have. There's also another list called Instrumental Activities of Daily Living, or IADLs, that include things like going up or down steps, keeping track of your bank account, shopping for groceries, and so on. Benjamins uses these lists to count up how many disabilities people have. But this is where the chicken or egg problem comes up again. If you have these limitations today, they may discourage you from going to church. This would mean that the disability causes your lack of church attendance, and this is the opposite of what Benjamins wants to study. She's trying to find out whether the church attendance could be causing you to have better health. Her solution to this tough problem is to measure whether you're going to church at one point in time, and then a few years later, see how much your list of ADL or IADL problems may have changed. If people going to church back in the past have added few ADL problems some years later, that could mean that church attendance helped preserve their health. At least this would be a possible interpretation. We'll come back to that point later. Now that we know exactly how we're going to measure health, we have to decide how to measure religiosity. There are probably as many different dimensions of religiosity that we could consider as there are different measures of health. After complaining about this for a second, Benjamins sorts out a couple of measures that she actually wants to use. These are both some of the most commonly collected and widely studied measures of religiosity. One of them, self-reported frequency of church attendance, measures our actions or activity, that is, outward behavior. The other, a response to a question about how important religion is for making decisions in your everyday life, measures our attitudes, that is, an internal psychological state. Benjamins wants to use both kinds of measures, so she chooses the most well-known examples from each side of the attitudes versus actions boundary. When we look at the first of these, frequency of religious attendance, we find lots of evidence that this outward activity increases with age, at least up to a point when these disabilities might start to become a limiting factor in their own right. The other measure of the subjective importance that people attach to religion in their lives, which Benjamins calls salience, also increases steadily for older ages, with no sign of leveling off at the oldest ages. This might be because physical disabilities pose no barrier, even for the oldest old, to their beliefs in the way that might happen for their activities. Sociologists love this word salience and use it a lot. It comes from Old Latin and even older words meaning to leap out ahead of others. It is established in military jargon so that a salient is a position along a defensive line, such as trenches or castle walls, that juts out from the rest toward the enemy. So salience here means that religion stands out from the rest of a person's life in importance. All of these measures, including reports of limitations in various activities of daily living, frequencies of church attendance, and subjective reports about the importance of religion, were included in a long questionnaire administered to a nationally representative sample of thousands of older people in the United States in a survey of assets and health dynamics among the oldest old, usually just called the AHEAD survey. So Benjamins just turned on her computer, loaded up the respondents from this survey, and went to work on her dissertation. The really valuable feature of this survey, for her purposes, comes from its longitudinal character. The same people have been interviewed several times at intervals several years apart. She measures all of her disability measures in 1995 and also measures religious activity and attitudes at the same time, along with a bunch of other factors that she suspects might need to be taken into account as separate influences on health. Then she comes back to the same people interviewed 5 years later in 2000 and checks up on their disability measures again. So the outcome she wants to examine is whether people added new disabilities between 1995 and 2000, after we already measured their religious involvement in 1995. This kind of before and after ordering is one way we can try to answer the chicken and egg question of causal order. She also can use the AHEAD data to look into her question about oldest old versus younger old people, because about 1/8 of the AHEAD sample was over age 85, giving her enough really old respondents for reliable patterns and answers. For her intervening explanations, the things that might connect religion to health, she measures social supports by whether respondents had a marriage partner or not, whether they had children or not, and even whether they actually got some financial support from children. This last item is mainly important only for some of the very oldest old people. She admits that there are lots of other kinds of social supports available in old age, such as the living arrangements made famous by the award-winning Golden Girls TV show, But despite that show's popularity, that's not actually how most older Americans arrange their personal lives. If they no longer have spouses or children at home with them, most older Americans actually live alone. So her measure is a pretty good one that makes sense. For the health behaviors that might be discouraged or encouraged by your religion, she selects reports from the AHEAD data about smoking or drinking alcohol, both things that most religions advise you not to abuse, and whether or not people get regular, strenuous exercise. I'm not as aware that most religions want you to go out there swimming laps or doing yoga in order to be pleasing in the sight of God, but Benjamins thinks that maybe people will connect this with the idea that your body is a temple and so on, so she throws it in the list of predictors. If you look at her Table 1 showing the basic patterns of all these predictors, you can see that both the good things and the bad things on the health behavior list are less common at ages above age 85. People smoke and drink less at those ages, but they also exercise less, so the health behaviors may cancel each other out and end up working pretty much the same no matter how old you get. With everything all measured and set up from the AHEAD data survey results, she's ready to find out whether religion really does make a difference after 5 years in how many new disabilities people have had to cope with. With all of the framework constructed by Benjamins, we can cut right to the chase and find out whether religiosity keeps you healthy in old age, or at least we can try. There are a lot of results crowded into her Table 2, showing several different models predicting how many disabilities you should expect to have. Each model appears in a separate column of the table, starting with the simplest one on the left and progressing to the most complicated one on the right. We'll start with Model 3, which includes both of her religious measures: activity, measured as frequency of going to church, and salience, measured by how subjectively important religion seems to you. Paradoxically, the way to study this table is to start at the bottom, with the model intercept of 1.96 shown there. This means that people expect to have 1.96 disabilities on average, at least if they were in the default comparison group as defined by her various measures. For each of her religious measures, she left out one category. For church attendance, the left out category is never. For importance of religion, the left out category is no importance. So that intercept reference group with an average of 1.96 disabilities includes the respondents who attach no importance to religion and who never go to church. If Benjamins is right, everybody else should report fewer disabilities than this non-religious bunch of respondents. And sure enough, if you look up in the table, you see negative signs on all the coefficients for the other categories of church attendance and also for importance of religion. All those asterisks means that each of these categories of people have significantly fewer disabilities than the non-religious reference group. There's also a line in the table for how many disabilities they started with in 1995. So these estimates refer to new disabilities that people have added since then. For convenience, I've added these coefficients to the intercept, including a coefficient of 0 for the left-out group, and show all the groups here by the predicted number of disabilities the model estimates for them. All the people who go to church, no matter how often they go, enjoy about half a disability less on average than the non-religious reference group. So the church attendance effect shows up as fewer new limitations, just as Benjamins expected. On the other hand, Benjamins confesses that she was surprised and puzzled by the results for importance of religion. The more important you said religion was to you in 1995, the more disabilities you added to your condition by 2000. This higher level of disability increased incrementally with each step up in importance of religion. After fumbling with this strange result for a moment, Benjamins decides to wait with any final interpretation until we know about the other intervening factors. After all, it could be that the people who felt religion was the most important also tended to be the oldest in the sample, and they would tend to have more disabilities. Women often see religion as more important than do men, and women also have more disabilities, because when things go wrong for men, they're more likely just to die rather than surviving with disabilities. There are several of these added explanatory factors to consider, so she adds them a few at a time to more complicated models as we move across Table 2 from left to right. Eventually, we reach Model 5, which is the most complicated one we will consider here. We're going to skip over the last two with even more complicated interaction effects because, first of all, they would just give you a headache, and second, they don't add anything important to the results. The first thing you have to remember when you look at Model 5 is that the intercept has changed dramatically from a positive 1.95 to a negative 6.73, and this makes no sense because you can't have a negative number of disabilities, can you? But this model includes age measured in single years as a predictor, and unless you do something to that measure, the default reference group for the intercept is now people with a 0 value for that variable as well as for the others. This means people 0 years old. The people in this survey had an average age of 71.8, not 0, your age when you're born. If we multiply the average age of 71.8 times the age coefficient of 0.11, then that intercept value goes up from negative 6.73 back to something like 2 disabilities for people at the average sample age, as shown in the figure here. This figure also assumes the average scores on self-rated health and the average number of chronic conditions in the sample. In this figure, we see essentially the same result as the first one, which didn't include any of these correction factors. Once we take into account all the effects of these added factors, including the social support and health behavior variables, about half of the effect of church attendance disappears. The remaining contrasts between attendance categories are not as significant as the unadjusted ones were, but church attendance is still linked to adding fewer new disabilities. But the tendency for people who place more importance on religion also to add more disabilities in the next 5 years stubbornly persists in these adjusted results and is just about as significant as it was before. This is not due then to other details about people such as being older or being women or not being married or any of the rest of it. The only thing that I can think of is that perhaps one reason that people might think that religion is more important in their lives is because they know that there is a history of some kinds of disabilities in their family, and that even if they didn't have these in 1995, they knew something might be coming, and they looked to religion for comfort and consolation. When people expect or experience afflictions, like the tribulations visited on Job in the Bible, they can sometimes turn to religion in their hour of need. Maybe there are other questions in the Ahead survey that would let you test this for yourself someday. In the meantime, we can have a quick look at the actual connections of those other intervening factors themselves on additional disabilities. This turns out to be quite simple. The health behaviors, or at least 2 of the 3, are very strongly related to whether you add new disabilities. Smokers added an average of an extra half a disability more than did non-smokers. And people who exercised vigorously 3 times a week added a half a disability less than did the couch potatoes in the sample. Drinking had no effect, though. Neither did any of the social support variables, such as being married or having children. People added disabilities at roughly the same rate, regardless of their family connections. So these intervening variables carry a useful message. Even when you get really old, your lifestyle will continue to affect your health. So quit smoking today and go get some exercise, and then keep it up for another 50 or 60 years at least. Finally, Benjamin has to admit that her question about different effects of religion for oldest versus younger old people was a dead end. It is true that the oldest old have more disabilities, but all of these predictors work in pretty much the same way for them as for the younger elderly. There is no need, she says, to split up the older ages into smaller bands in order to understand the effects of religiosity on disabilities.